Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome back. Specifically, welcome back to the channel after my vacation. It was a very calm vacation. Got to have a snowy Christmas, and I was really happy. I needed the rest and relaxation. And thank everyone for just waiting it out. I know I said I would have videos during that week, and I decided that it was I just didn't want to record a lot on Saturday. Plus, I had a little bit of packing left to do and all that stuff. Anyway, so today we're continuing the series on the political history of the United States of America, and the last episode we talked about the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederation. And today we're talking about the Seven Years' Wars. This is a major event in American history, and uh, a lot of people call it the French and Indian War here in the United States. The reason why I don't is because this was part of the larger Seven Years' War, and actually, the Seven Years' War was started because of Fort Necessity and the battle between Washington's forces. That's George Washington, Colonel George Washington at this time, and French forces. In addition, it can be a little bit confusing because the Seven Years' War was truly a world war. While it was fought mostly between France and Britain, with some involvement from the Spanish and the Dutch, the Prussians, a few others in Europe, at least in the European theater. There was there were conflicts all over in the East Indies. So that's Indonesia, not really China, but Southeast Asia. So I believe it was called Siam at the time. A little bit in India, a touch in certain parts of Africa, not much in South America, and a decent amount in North America, and of course the European theater. And some of these theaters are actually listed as separate wars, but they're really part of the larger conflict between France and its allies and Britain and its allies. So to call it the French and Indian War, it would be slightly confusing to someone who isn't American. Um, to view this and say, wait, France fought India when? Or to somebody who isn't familiar with their history very much. Now, most of most Americans, at least at the time, while there were redcoats, the actual British military was fighting in the American theater. Most of the redcoats were actually, and most of the British Army were actually fighting in uh, Europe and the East Indies rather than the West Indies. So the colonial militias, such as the Massachusetts militia, New Hampshire militia, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia militias, they all had to, as well as the militias from the Carolinas, they all had to pick up some of the slack. And that's why prominent colonists actually held officer positions in the British military at this time and during this war. And this is where a lot of the American officer corps from the American Revolution got their start in the military, and where they kind of learned how a military should function. Were the American commanders particularly good? Some were better than others. Washington was admittedly a failure as a field commander, at least in this war. And we'll talk about Washington as a commander in the field versus from the office when we get to the Revolution, because it is important. But the fact that colonial militias had to pick up the slack from the British to a greater or lesser extent, depending on which historians you consult and depending on which sources you look at, whether they be British or colonial or other, maybe even French. It really depends on who you talk to, how much the colonists actually took care of the fighting in the American theater. Obviously, the war was over this disputed territory between New France, what is now Quebec, and as in the province of Quebec, not the city of Quebec. And the 13 colonies, mostly the dispute was the Ohio River Valley as well as portions of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Basin. Not quite all the way down to New Orleans, but certainly down to the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. And definitely into Tennessee, Kentucky, what is now Southwest Virginia, West Virginia, Western North Carolina, that sort of thing. But eventually, the British did win, and, well, France lost all of the New World colonies, save for one or two islands off of Canada and Haiti. And because of how little settled the French colonial possessions were outside of New Orleans and what is now the Canadian province of Quebec, there's very little vestiges of French culture in the New World outside of certain portions of New England, certain parts of New York, and mostly that's extreme upstate, and it's really limited to place names, unlike in certain parts of New England. And then down to certain place names in the Mississippi Basin, all the way down to Louisiana. And Louisiana actually certainly has the most French culture outside of Quebec in North America. But this really started to form an American identity, this war. And a lot of that had to do with American colonists viewing that they won the war in the American theater and they kicked the French out, not the British. You know, this also allowed colonists from different colonies to actually meet each other. Pennsylvanians met New Yorkers. People from Massachusetts met Virginians. Not all that common, but it did happen. New Englanders met Southerners. Everybody met and learned that they hated New Jersey. That sort of thing. And this is kind of where an American identity starts being formed in some minds. Obviously, it wasn't nearly the sort of, oh, we want independence now. Well, no, that didn't happen at all. they still consider themselves loyal British subjects. And this was kind of where they were starting to think, yeah, we're not just British subjects, but we're British citizens. We deserve representation in Parliament. And they claimed that because they had done such a good job, they deserved it. And they had earned it. And their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were British citizens. And that they had representation when they were living in the old world. So we should get they should get representation, the Americans. So that's kind of what happened. It was actually a relatively quiet war. Simply because, at least in the New World, because it was very difficult to get troops over here from the Old World to fight in conflicts when a lot of key targets were over in the Old World or in, at the time, more profitable colonies in the East Indies outside of the Brits, really liking southern tobacco and cotton, and New England timber, but they figured that the British colonists could hold it on their own. Now, the interesting thing about this is that some of the name French and Indian War is a bit of a misnomer to an extent. And the reason for that is because Native American tribes aligned with whomever they believed they were getting a better deal from with regards to European settlement. The vast majority did side with the French, simply because outside of the St. Lawrence River Valley, the French didn't build a lot of cities. They didn't colonize a ton. They were more interested in trading and setting up missionary outposts. A few forts, sure, but that was to protect their claims. They weren't building cities. At least not to the extent that the British were. The Brits really got to town building cities. And truly colonizing. And if I remember correctly, the Haudenosaunee that we spoke about previously, the Iroquois, they did side with the Brits. It was either that, or it was either that they sided with the Brits or they were neutral. They declared neutrality. And we'll talk about some of the southern native nations in future episodes. Specifically the 5 civilized tribes, as they are sometimes referred to. And that would be the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee, and the Seminole. Muskogee are sometimes called the Creek. But anyway, that's going to be it for today. I hope you all enjoyed. See you next time. Take it easy. Have a very nice evening, and I'll see you all on Wednesday. Bye-bye.